veuillez vous asseoir, s'il vous plaît. So I've actually sort of gotten used to having Neyron do the introductions for her series. I realize this is our first lecture in the other part of the Now series, and so it's I find myself at the podium again, but it's been a while. So welcome. First, I'll start off with a couple announcements. Our Insider Trading Marathon continues this week on Thursday and Friday, and then continues on next week as well. So pay attention, those signs on the doors actually are different every day. And come to the lunchtime talks, those are very important. Also, next week, Neyron's last lecture for her series, for the New Commons series, will be on Tuesday night with the Belgian architect Xavier de Heter, who's a terrific designer. I would say really one of the top designers I know. I think really, really very good work. So that is Tuesday at the MFA, with the reception starting at 6 and the lecture at 7. But tonight we welcome Sebastien Marot, who's here, standing right here. I'll just talk for a few minutes before I give you the podium. So Cornell University has long been Rice's rival on the Bachelor of Architecture horizon, though why anybody would want to spend 5 years in the snowy, rural, northern climes of Ithaca, New York, population 30,000, and current temperature 30 degrees, is well beyond me. And sorry, Marcel Merwin, for dissing your hometown, but frankly, I can't understand anyone who wants to live in Ithaca. In any case, our guest tonight, Sebastien Marot, has made Ithaca the focus of many of his theoretical attentions. He's cast a net across several disciplines: geography, science, agriculture, engineering, art, writing, and architecture, and several personalities, most notably Colin Rowe, O.M. Ungers, and Rem Koolhaas, and has concluded that one can find in Ithaca a model for what he terms as a suburbanism, an urbanism whose program emerges from its site and from the memories contained within that site. Marot, who is decidedly French, which of course coming from me is an utter compliment, is a philosopher and a historian by training, and a critic in architecture and landscape design. Now, Sebastien seems at first blush to be an unlikely candidate for this expertise on rural or suburban America. Professor at l'École d'Architecture de la Ville des Territoires Marne-la-Vallée, where he has taught since its founding in 1998, and visiting professor at numerous universities, including the ETH Zurich and Harvard, among others. He's also the founding and former editor of the journal Le Visiteur, which features architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism. He's the author of the book Suburbanism and the Art of Memory, which was published in 2003, and along with Florian Hertwig, the forthcoming, within months, I believe, the forthcoming book, The City in the City, Berlin, A Green Archipelago, which analyzes Unger's manifesto of the shrinking city within the context of post-war Berlin, as well as that of the contemporary city. In reading Sebastien's writings, however, it becomes utterly convincing that a Frenchman could teach us all about the American suburban landscape and about particular theories and mythologies that have emerged from Ithaca. Ungers was German, Rowe was British, Rem is Dutch. In a sense, it's utterly normal that another outsider could mine Ithaca for its novelties. Sebastien comfortably mines multiple territories in all that he does, and yet he always anchors them back to architecture with the process of a deep genealogical drilling. I'm grateful to have gotten Sebastien here to Houston and hope that he can find similar fodder to whet his theoretical appetites in this, our very urban model of American suburbia. Please join me in welcoming Sebastien Marot, whose talk tonight is entitled The Present Environmental Predicament, Design and the Limits to Growth. Bienvenue.
So I just press this, right?
I believe that's true.
Okay. So I'm very grateful to you, Sarah, for bringing me here. It's my first time in Houston. I will not speak about Ithaca. You know, it happened to me once where I was invited to give a lecture at the University of Pennsylvania in a symposium and give a lecture, and all my talk was on Ithaca when it was like commencement day, or you know, where they were receiving potential candidates to Virginia, so they were a little unhappy. I did that nothing, so I won't do that anyway. And I'm not a specialist of American suburbia. I use that word suburbanism is a bit bizarre in French, and I use it for a different purpose. So I won't talk about Ithaca. I've pieced together a few things. I hope it will make sense. And I'm grateful also because it's been years that I have had a kind of latent curiosity for Houston. It all comes from that book, which I read maybe 10 years ago. I remember buying it at the Triangle Bookshop in London and grabbing and reading parts of it and being kind of, you know, interested, very interested in this, and puzzled by this attempt to emulate Rainer Banham, and really puzzled especially by this. The large glass reflected on Houston. I reread the book because I had, you know, remembrances of that book. I remembered that it had affected me, but didn't know exactly why. So I grabbed it and read it in the plane coming here. And now I understand why. But I won't be too much talking about that, but maybe it will pop up in the lecture. The large glass, probably it had a subliminal influence on me, this image you'll see. You said, I define myself as a visitor. I'm not an architect, I'm not a landscape architect, but I'm among architects a visitor. It's been now 20 years or more. As a visitor, I'll just say a few things about you so that you understand me. As a visitor, I have a few heroes, and among them I have that one, J.B. Jackson. I'm a fan of J.B. Jackson, and especially of that book here. This is a book, you know, it's collections of essays, Jackson. All Jackson's books are made like that, collections of essays. But they are very, very well built, those collections of essays. For instance, this one starts with a singular. What is landscape? What does that mean, that word landscape? And ends with a plural, called concluding with landscapes. As if the answer to what is landscape was landscapes. In this concluding essay, Jackson explains that from his whole life that he spent in visiting landscapes in Europe, in the States, he saw three landscapes. Landscape 1, Landscape 2, and Landscape 3. Landscape 1, this is how I illustrate his idea of it. He called either the medieval landscape or the vernacular landscape. You'll see I'm interested by this hesitation between the two words. What he meant was that the medieval or vernacular landscape was a kind of patois of landscape. It was a landscape that made sense very locally, you know, that used the material at hand, etc. But also, he said, it was an ever-changing landscape, you know, the three-field system, everything. It was a moving, constantly evolving landscape. Then he said, there is landscape 2, which he also called by several different names. One was the classical landscape, or the political landscape, or the aristocratic landscape. And he said this landscape 2 was in every way opposed to landscape 1. When landscape 1 made sense very, very locally, landscape 2 made sense on a much broader scale. And when landscape 1 was an ever-changing one, this one was a landscape of fixed limits, of conventions, etc. It's the vehicular language of landscape as opposed to the vernacular one. Then he said there is landscape 3, and he had no names for landscape 3. But we understand that this is the landscape that took over, maybe starting the Industrial Revolution, but really taking over after World War II, at least in post-war America, and he literally spent his life investigating that landscape, the strip of the shoe boxes aligned, outside the city. And what he suggested was that landscape 3 had something to do again with landscape 1, that it was an ever-changing one, and hence the title of the book, Discovering the Vernacular Landscape. There would be something like that here again. Okay, I'm not so much interested in the distinction in itself as in the hesitation of Jackson in naming them, there. Because the issue for me is, are they the medieval, the classical, and the emerging, meaning historical distinction, or are they in some way all contemporary to one another? You all may have a kind of landscape 1 that you went to, that is kind of very local, the classical landscape, the grid of Jefferson, etc., you know it, the political one, so it's still there, it's there. And the landscape 3, of course, you know it too. So in a way, they are all contemporary, juxtaposed. And if I look at the way artists here, photographers, look at landscape, I can sense a kind of interest for this juxtaposition or even superimposition of those different landscapes, the very local and the classical and the emerging. I think that many of the landscapes that we know are neither 1 or 2 or 3, but both, but all the 3 together, many of them, which is the reason why I find it helpful to use sometime, it's a bit awful, bizarre, but the term hyper-landscape, not to say a super-landscape, just a landscape which is made, as many of them, of several regimes of landscape. Most landscapes are, in fact, hyper-landscapes, where landscapes are superimposed. In another book, this one, The Necessity for Ruins, which I translated in French, that I like very much, you find right in the middle a text which is very important to me, which is called Landscape as Theater. Jackson explains in that text, very short, that the metaphor through which landscape 2, the aristocratic, the classical, the one we've been taught to love, or were taught to love. The metaphor through which it was envisioned, meaning both read and built, was that of the theater. The theater was the matrix through which landscape 2 was envisioned. But the problem, he said, is that we are still looking at landscape, most people still looking at landscape through that lens, the theater. A landscape should be, a scene that makes sense from a certain point of view, that is, coherent, etc., consistent. And this does not enable us to envision, love, understand real landscapes of today. So, at the end of the essay, he said, we need badly another metaphor, but we haven't found it. We are still searching. This is what he said, the early 80s. So, my question to Jackson, I've never met him, but if I had met him, would have been a new metaphor for what? For landscape 3, in the hypothesis where it would be the landscape of today, or a new metaphor for hyper landscapes, meaning, those landscapes made of several landscapes. Because if that was the case, so that's the theater matrix, with this famous engraving that was published by John Dixon Hunt, which I like very much. It's typically the theatrical matrix, where you have, is that a pointer? Where you have, on the foreground, you have the three nature aligned, right? Let's say wilderness, inhabited by goddesses and allegories in the background. Then the second nature, agriculture, nature as transformed by man for its own uses. And then in the foreground, third nature, meaning the garden for the humanists. They talk about the garden as a third nature. So you have here prospectively aligned in a theatrical matrix the three nature are. Because if the issue is to find a metaphor for hyper landscapes, then some have been proposed for now 20 to 30 years, maybe to 40 years even, right? Several have been proposed by specialists of landscape or urban design or historians of architecture, etc. One is the famous palimpsest, which you see here now, which compares, in a way, those situations, those territories where we have remnants of a very local situation with a classical grid over it and then an emerging landscape on top of it. You can compare those situations to those palimpsests where several different writings or resources were superimposed to one another that had nothing to do with one another on principle, but were sharing the same site or situation, the page. So maybe this could be a possibility. Right? That's a metaphor, a proposal. But Jackson probably wouldn't have accepted that as a good candidate to replace, to take over the role of the theater. Because the palimpsest is the curiosity of epigraphy. We do not use palimpsest. It's not like the theater shaping our minds, right, on principle. It's that's archaeology in a way. And Jackson's make a big difference between metaphor, powerful shaping metaphor, and what he calls an analogy. An analogy, very good analogy, bad metaphor. I wonder why I still like it. I know it's a bit passé now, but I still like that metaphor, that analogy, which I think has a metaphorical power still. And I try to understand why. And I recently, that means 5 years ago, understood why. Because I had read, long time ago, that metaphor. I had found it when I was not interested in architecture at the time. I was into literature. I was translating literature. And in fact, I had found it somewhere. And the guy who introduced it, actually, I think, that metaphor, is this guy. So that's the famous book, essay by André Gambou's, The Territory as a Palimpsest, 1981, I think. But I had read it before in this guy. You know who this guy is? This is the English opium eater, Thomas de Quincey. Thomas de Quincey, if you remember, in the Confessions of an English Opium Eater, doesn't mean that you need to take opium to follow me, but it might help. He uses it very powerfully. Let's read him. I like to read. What else than a natural and mighty palimpsest is the human brain? Such a palimpsest is my brain. Such a palimpsest, all reader, is yours. Everlasting layers of ideas, images, feelings have fallen upon your brain softly as light. Each succession has seemed to bury all that went before, and yet, in reality, not one has been extinguished. And if in the vellum palimpsest lying amongst the other diplomata of human archives or libraries, there is anything fantastic or which moves to laughter, as oftentimes there is in the grotesque collisions of those successive themes, having no natural connection, which by pure accident have consecutively occupied the role, yet in our own heaven-created palimpsest, the deep memorial palimpsest of the brain, there are not and cannot be such incoherencies. The fleeting accidents of a man's life and its external shows may indeed be irrelate and incongruous, but the organizing principles which fuse into harmony and gather about fixed, predetermined centers, whatever heterogeneous elements life may have accumulated from without, will not permit the grandeur of human unity greatly to be violated, or its ultimate repose to be troubled in the retrospect from dying moments or from other great convulsions. That's nice, no? It's a nice period. You see, anyway. So, I translated De Quincey, not that one, but others, and I suddenly remembered that I had found that. So it's palimpsestrous even, you know, the palimpsest is palimpsest. Another candidate, more acceptable maybe, is the hypertext. The hypertext, there is no question that we are shaped by it, I think. This is a powerful matrix that is transforming the way we think, the way we act, the way we relate to things. So, you know, all these protocols that allow you to navigate between resources that are completely independent from one another on principle, but which, thanks to those hyperlinks, you can link together, you know, and piece together, etc. So, the hypertext maybe is a better one. But the hypertext and the palimpsests share a lot in many ways, I think. They are both ways of putting together things that have nothing to do, right, in a way, and to put them together. Okay. One is physical, the other is more labile, you know, labile. Okay. So maybe we can combine them. Combine the two metaphors, and by the way, keep the theater also within the whole thing, and make a kind of hyper metaphor, you know, of hyper landscapes, etc. All right. What I feel is that indeed, when we are interested in envisioning hyper landscapes, what might be useful, like Glasler suggested, is to look back at what happened in art 100 years ago, when the guys, and it was before Einstein theses were like propagated, you know, which made time the fourth dimension, like clearly, when those artists before that were trying to represent, in a way, a four-dimensional reality. Because in a way, a landscape of landscapes is, at least metaphorically, a four-dimensional entity or reality. And indeed, among the artists that were interested into the fourth dimension, one that really spent his life, ironically of course, with many into that question, way after Einstein was, is of course Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp, and you can of course consider that the large glass, his masterpiece, this mandala, is behind its pataphysical tale about, you know, the love and erotic relationship. You know, you have for those who wouldn't know, so you have basically the domain of the bachelors rendered in perspectival geometry here on that part of the glass, and here you have the bride, and it's called Bride stripped bare by her bachelors even. And this thing here, which Duchamp called the bride's mantle, forbid any easy relationship between the two things. But the bride blossoms in a four-dimensional realm when the bachelors are prisoners, in a way, of their three-dimensional world. So behind that pataphysics of erotics, there is also a meditation about the relationship between, you could say, a landscape or three-dimensional reality and a four-dimensional one. This being a kind of perspective hinge between the two. So we could use, actually, and I think Lars Lerner was very suggestive when he did that on Houston. Use it as a window to look at landscape, a kind of different window, not theatrical one there. I like to superimpose those two images because you find here also the bride's mantle, separating the third nature from the two others. Looks like a tennis net, right? Here, kind of abstract line, probably a aha, really separating the two things. But here it is organizing prospectively, the relationship of the three natures. When here it's sorry, what did I do? It's much more vertical, so it's verticalized. Duchamp himself suggested that in a little drawing that he did at the end of his life in the 50s, when he redrew the whole apparatus of the glass, and in transparency you can see a landscape of rolling hills with, by the way, a telephone pole or electric pole here and all related to the things there, right? So we could look at landscapes, three-dimensional landscapes, through that kind of four-dimensional window. And then, of course, this is what he explained, almost literally, with his last work, which could be seen as the large glass rotated horizontally, and what would you see through the bride's mantle there. Another thing I need to explain that interests me and led me to the thing I'm going to talk to you, not Ithaca, is when I got interested into architecture and urban design and landscape, I was interested very much at some point into landscape architecture and what people from landscape architecture were bringing to the understanding of design. And to make it very short, I used two words. What I thought is that landscape architects were, in France at that time, or in the Netherlands, were envisioning differently the hierarchy between all the components of design. That in a way, they were looking at the program through the sites. That the site, hypothetically, was creating the program, was engendering the program. When in architecture, very often, it's the other way around, right? Or let's say with contextualists, for example, you bring together the two things, in a kind of equilibrium, the science and the program, and you try to find a good consensual dialectics between the two, right? So what was at stake, in my view, with a few landscape architects that I was interested in, was that they were doing, in the field of urban design, a kind of subversion of the hierarchy between those components, which I call sub-urbanism, right? An urbanism that came from the bottom up, so with the program, from the site to the program. Of course, I'm aware that another subversion, contemporary to that one, that came from rather the realm of architecture, of certain architects, was doing exactly the opposite. Was engendering the site through or by or from the program. So that was some of the images I used to talk of that suburbanist thing. The Poussin paintings, looking at the city from the space, what we call suburbia, And where you see traces of old construction emerging in that thing, you know, there is a kind of architecture of the ground, or from the ground, coming there. So the same space has changed a lot. This is a photo of Raymond de Bardon, where, you know, that's the anti-theatrical thing par excellence, you see. You are exactly looking at that photo where you shouldn't be. You know, no sign is for you, right? No, nothing makes sense in a way. So of course, changed a lot. All right. So, yeah, I was saying there was another symmetrical subversion of that dialectics of program and site coming from architecture, doing exactly the reverse, where with the program, you genetically produce a site, a new site, an artificial site. A building, you know, is a site. And, you know, some projects you know are quite explicitly doing this. And as a matter of fact, I've always considered Delirious New York as the undisputed manifesto for what I call super urbanism, for that reason. All right, and Cole has even transported into the field of landscape design that poetic of suburbanism with his famous project for La Villette, you know, laying a programmatic carpet, you know, transforming the site like that. I did a piece at some point to try to express the parallel between those two approaches, between Rem's project for La Villette and what I consider a modest masterpiece of suburbanism, which is the bamboo garden that landscape architect Alexandre Chemetov actually did in the park done by Chewy there. Okay. Now I move to another thing. This is my last holidays in last April. Not my last holidays, I took some others, but this was in last April, where we went with a couple of people on the canals of France. This very slow motion thing, you know, you take a little boat, it's like 4 miles an hour, and some people do that, you know. And we were, in fact, we had no idea to do that, you know. It was just that, so you see here, we knew nobody. This is a German physicist, this is a banker from Los Angeles, this is somebody from Japan, two of them specialists of sustainable development and things. This is an ex-Green deputy of Germany, this is a guy from Vienna working in the Ministry of Environment. This is my friend. But we all came here because of that guy, which is here. This guy is Dennis Meadows. I'd be curious to know who among the young people here have ever heard of Dennis Meadows. Please raise your hand. That's a really interesting thing to me, because he's one of my heroes. Dennis Meadows, which you see here, was, he was the captain. We were all smiling at him. Dennis Meadows, you see him like 30 to 40 years ago, here, with Jay Forrester and other specialists of systems dynamics at the MIT in 1972. When they produced, on a commission of the Club of Rome, that fantastic book and study, which you probably have heard of, you know, called The Limits to Growth. This was a book that had a tremendous impact at the time, where those guys, commissioned by the Club of Rome, that is, a couple, 100 people in the world who were mostly working for big firms here or there, or working in international organizations such as the UN or the etc., gathered privately at Rome, hence the name, to share their concerns about the evolution of the world. And at some point, the first meeting were very bad. They couldn't understand each other. It was a language problem, but also physicists, you know, people from all kinds of discipline. So they decided to commission the laboratory of systems dynamics at MIT, Jay Forrester, who had written things on cities, also as systems, etc., a study on the state and evolution of the world, you know, in terms of resources, demography, and everything. So a hyper-complex problematic, as people said at the time, which these young guys tried to model. You know, so they built up a very complex model, gathering all kinds of data that they could, you know, and examining all the retroaction loop between them, you know. So it basically was that, you know, they looked at population, evolution, they looked at natural resources, food, industry, all kinds of stuff. So. And they built that model, and that model told them, they worked by scenario, in the business as usual thing, if things continued to go the way they went, they said most probably, you know, around the first third of the 21st century, we might expect a global economic collapse. You know? So the population would start to go down, etc. The pollution would be, etc. Terrible thing. The thing is that then they did scenarios, the typical scenarios that you would expect from them. You said, okay, so if the situation is that bad, basically, we are not so stupid. We're going to react, and we have several ways of reacting. One, they say, maybe we could become much more efficient in the way we use the existing resources. First time, people would say, yes, but in fact, we have much more resources than what we think. We keep discovering things. So they said, no problem. We take the model, we take the resource thing, and we double it by hypothesis. And then we run the model, and we see what happens. Problem, they said, if that is so, we might expect the collapse to intervene, let's say, 10 years after, but it will be worse. Because the population will have grown more, pollution more, etc. And so it will come. But that's not a very good solution. Then people say, okay, but we are going to be also much more efficient in the way we use the actual resources. You know, it's factor fear. You know, okay, so it's not that simple, but they modeled it. So we increase by 4 the efficiency in using it, and say. Maybe the collapse, the curve will be a little smoother, but the industrial output will have been up, etc., and collapse. Okay, maybe we can control population growth. Same. I'm going fast, but in a way, all the single solution went into the wall, right into the wall, except those where they were all combined. That you expect, you hope that there is more resources. Then you become, in effect, much more efficient in the use. Then you control population. Then you ask less, right, etc. In that situation, maybe, so you could say, that's stupid because in a way, that's what common sense, you know, would gather. You don't follow one or a solution, follow all them at the same time. You know, they're all important and interesting. Anyway, they continued working. They did a 20 years update in the 90s, which was significantly called Beyond the Limit. And then the 30 years update in 2004, that's sustained research, right? Not that many in that field, where basically they said the same thing, except that we were 30 years after, and it made only things a little worse, of course. So I'm not going into that. So I invited him to give a lecture, and he gave that lecture, Preparing Cities for the Age of Declining Oil. And he started his lecture by saying to the student, don't expect me to talk about sustainability. It's too late. That's what he said. I'll speak about other things, but now all words much spoken of, like resilience or things like that, right? But it's too late for... So, in the title of this lecture, I kind of combined, you saw, two titles. One is of Colin Rowe. Colin Rowe wrote an article just after Collage City was published, which was a kind of conference that he gave when he went into many schools explaining the book, which was called The Present Urban Predicament. And whether we like or not what he was doing with Collage City, where we think it's very good or pathetic, what was behind his thought was that urbanism and urban design was in a kind of dead end, especially with zoning, the moderns and everything. We needed to go back into another, to another dialectics there, the collage, the figure ground stuff, etc. Today, I think we are in another situation, which I would call the present environmental predicament. I don't understand why we focus that much on the city, and I still wonder why we shouldn't put what we still call urbanism or urban design to retirement. It's a word that was coined at urbanism 120 years ago. It's probably too old today to accomplish a lot, and maybe it's not able to face the thing. Then the other was, of course, that book, The Limits to Growth. This is just a little thing. This was, this photo. I like especially the hand in this photo. It makes me think of that painting. The School of Athens, where you see represented, supposedly, all the great philosophers of antiquity. And where they all have a specific gesture, hand gesture, that is in a way summing up or catching the sense of their contribution to philosophy. And it's very much the case of the two central figures, which you see here, Plato and Aristotle here. Two very different, significant gestures with the hand. One is holding the Timeo, Plato here, and Aristotle, the ethics, right? And I like it because you see the hand of Plato, who is pointing to the world, ideas of pure essence, of truth, in a way, is completely inscribed in the architectural pilaster, which is behind, as if architecture was about upheaving the world, reaching a principle of hope, in a way, you could say. When Aristotle has a completely different gesture, which is that of prudence, you might say, okay, maybe, but maybe we should rather look at the way the world, the real world, functions, right? Which is a mix of idea and matter, and more complex, more contingent, right? Maybe we should. And so Denis Meadows is clearly inkling on Aristotle's side. You see. Okay. But it's of course a big thing. It's not program and site here. It's hope with Ernst Bloch. The principle hope, which was looking a bit into architecture, or at least it interested many architects at the time. The utopia as a engine for architecture, as opposed or complemented by the imperative, the principle of responsibility. For Hans Jonas, the question is not so much will we go further than our parents, but will we transmit to our kids a part of what we had from our parents? So it's a bit that kind of reverse of so, of course, we are in between those two things. How do we combine the principle of hope with the principle of responsibility in a world that looks finite? Okay. What we get in architecture concerning those issues, I like very much that. That's not at all to make fun of Brancolas. You will see that I'm not saying that just like that. But where you see, architects trying to keep up, what's happening in that field. It changes, it evolves every time, every day. And so we have a kind of blossoming of things, you know, landscape urbanism, ecological urbanism, all kinds of things. The concerns for shrinking cities in the whole world. These testimonies that maybe cities, or maybe we are getting out of the world of cities and even metropolises, that maybe they are not going to sustain that much. You know? Maybe that the big old situation is also a big city situation, that we are moving indeed into something else. How did the different manifestos coming from architects in the 70s, that is contemporary to the book The Limits to Growth, what were they saying at the time? We have, you know, the 70s are very interesting because there is a genre, a literary genre among architects that took place and like flourished in that period, which I call the site-specific manifesto, or the situated manifesto. Meaning a guy chooses a city, you know, or a metropolis, or her, and he's gonna see in that city all the, you know, the signs of the typical problems or solutions for the future of urban design and urbanism, right? In a way, a symptomatic city, a lens, local, that is going to tell us lessons for every kind of situation. It's the learning from syndrome, right? A very interesting genre. So you have typically, in the early 70s, when Limits to Growth was published, you have learning from Las Vegas here. You have a very interesting one, much less known, by Alvin Boyarsky, Chicago, called Chicago à la carte, the city as an energy system. Looking at all, you know, the fluxes that made Chicago, like in 50 years, from a little town of 30 houses into one of the world's metropolises there. So he's looking at that, and he was documenting, interestingly, through postcards at the time, which was a tremendous, of course, influence on Rem Koolhaas. And another example, of course, Los Angeles, the architecture of four ecologies, which Laslier emulated in a way in his text on Houston. And at the end, so after The Limits to Growth were published, of that decade, the 70s, the same year, the very same year, 1978, we have three very important site-specific manifestos. It would be questionable for this one. Is it really site-specific? I would argue that Rome is really the city behind the mind of Colin Rome, who took all his students from Ithaca to Rome every year. You know, that was the place where you would learn the dialectic, figure ground, the collage stuff, everything. Right? Then at the other end, of course, there is New York, the undisputed manifesto for superurbanism, alias Manhattanism, there. And in the middle, again, a manifesto that most of you know or have heard of, but maybe few of you have actually read. And this is the one, Berlin, a Green Archipelago, the city in the city, Berlin, a Green Archipelago, on which I'd like to focus now. To do that, okay, so just a reminder, Collage City, the manifesto for contextualism in Rome. Delirious New York, the manifesto for superurbanism in New York. And the city in the city, Berlin, a Green Archipelago, the manifesto for what? Urban disurbanism in Berlin. To go into that manifesto and understand it, we have to go a little into the story of the meeting between those two guys. Oswald Matthias Ungers, the German architect, born in 1926, and Rem Koolhaas, born in 1944. This is Rem Koolhaas, age 2 months. You have to remember that he was born in a city that was heavily bombed and transformed, a bit like Berlin at the time, and that he, at the time, his parents lived at the top of one of the buildings that were still there. This is the landscape that he had, you know, under his almost still closed eyes. We all know, and he wrote a lot about that, or talked a lot about that he spent 4 years from age 8 to 12 in Indonesia. In Indonesia, and he very often talks about this, you know, about the incredible experience that it was for a neurotic northerner to suddenly find himself into that environment. And it gave him, he said, determined frivolity. You know. Okay, the archipelago, ever since, he said, became a kind of ideal figure, you know, mixing a closed system with plurality, diversity, etc. Then we all know the story, becoming a typographer at the Haagse Post, you know, the journal, going into movies, writing a novel that was unpublished on Disney, from Disney World at age 16, Johan in Disneyland. He was fascinated by numbers. You know, Disneyland was a number, mass stuff that he was really interested in. So movies. With his friend René Daalder, he explained that they developed, what they had in common was a taste for movies, an addiction for movies, but also a taste for journalism, which in the Holland of the 60s was like, no way. Just no way you would think about journalism. You know. So of course the two guys, the two wunderkinds, you know, were listening to Wagner and etc. So the work at the Haagse Post, becoming a kind of journalist in this weekly magazine, being part of the Zero movement at the time, a kind of right-wing anarchist tendency, I would say. You see here, you know, all that photo where you see Rem Koolhaas as a journalist interviewing, you know, the beautifully dressed, interviewing the Provo guys, you know, the pre-68 movement in the Netherlands, and you can see that the atmosphere is not very good. Meeting Constant, we all know that through Bart Lootsma, beautiful article. And Bart Lootsma suggesting that that meeting with Constant might have been among the reasons why he turned his mind toward architecture. In fact, you all know also that his grandfather was a very important Dutch architect, that he spent a lot of time in his office, etc., etc., and that he developed also. But meeting with Constant and the discovery of New Babylon, that kind of itinerant nomadic system, you know, Bart Lootsma suggests might have been one of the reasons, especially when this Constant guy, who Koolhaas had all the reason to hate at that time, explained that it was not just a fantasy, but it was going to happen. It was a way of envisioning the society of leisure of tomorrow. And with Constant, we are looking also at other kinds of image coming from the situationist thing. I don't know if you know that one. You know that one by Ivan Shcheglov in the 1954, where you see fragments of a map of the world, you know, collage onto a metro map of Paris. Of course, you're much more familiar with this one. The Discours sur les passions de l'amour, which is a direct, of course, quotation or transposition of the 17th century map by Madeleine de Scudéry, mapping the topic of love, or mapping the topography of love, where you have the village of love here on the river of inclination, which is nice, which is leading to the dangerous sea of passion. So you just keep here too. So it's like an equal distance from that dangerous sea of passion and the lake of indifference. You know, so it's a whole map of those, all those feelings related to love. Okay, so we have here the guy whom Peter Cook at the Architectural Association called the boring fascist. You know, a guy who wanted to study architecture already at age 22, you know, real architecture, and not play with ping pong balls and everything. He was not at all into the fun stuff of the Architectural Association, was much more interested in what he already called the social condensers of the constructivists at the time, found a few guys with whom he could share that passion for modern architecture and for those kinds of stuff, especially Ilya Zengelis, and had, of course, a kind of attention for everything that was going on further, especially for Super Studio, which he invited at the Architectural Association at the time, with this kind of immoral tale, you know, of architecture homogeneously invading architecture, something in between. You don't know exactly what kind of utopia it is, you know, what sign it has, good, bad, you know, it's neither one or the other. It's playing just on the limits between the two, and that fascinates him at the time. And strangely enough, or not strangely enough, that utopia, that reversed or ambiguous utopia, went everywhere, and especially in Berlin, the monument leaving the old city untouched. So it's not bizarre at all that with his inkling for Germany, and with these examples such as that, he did his field trip that all students had to do. He chose the Berlin Wall as architecture. Others were looking, you know, at villas in Greece and all kinds of stuff. He chooses that. And he will describe the thing that he learned by documenting the Berlin Wall as reverse epiphanies, counter-revelations, in a way. And so they are numerous, like the 5 points of architecture, in a way, reverse. The power of absence over that of presence. The fact that architecture is a script, or in that case, is a script. The metamorphosis of one given dispositif, you know, along all the situations that it traverses, etc. So he gathers a few reverse epiphanies, and then, but he does something else, which is not a counter-revelation, but a pure and simple revelation that happens in Berlin, is that he discovers all the work that Oswald Matthias Ungers had done in that city while he was teaching at the TU between 63 and 68. And this is a total revelation for him. So you see here Ungers surviving as an architect in post-war Germany, here with Reinhard Gieselmann, with whom he wrote a little manifest in 60 called Zu einer neuen Architektur, where he says that freedom can exist only in the permanent conflict of the individual with reality and in the acknowledgement of our responsibility towards the place, the time, and the people. Architecture is a vital penetration in a context which is always plural, mysterious, cultivated, and structured. Its creative mission is to make the situation visible, to order the existing, to accentuate and amplify the place. It always consists in a rediscovery of the genius loci from which it proceeds. The work of Ungers, we all know that house, his office that he built, that made him all of a sudden famous, was interpreted by critics. I mean, critics saw each of them what they wanted to see in it. You know, Rainer Banham found it an example of new brutalism. Rossi described a new rationalism emerging there, and Pevsner saw a new rebirth of expressionism. So Ungers, he says it himself, he was completely lost. He didn't know, am I an expressionist, a brutalist, you know. So, but it made him instantly famous. And then his work, to go very fast, at the scale of urbanism, an incredible empathy for sites and situation. He will describe it as die Rationalisierung des Bestehenden, the rationalization of the existing, you know, transposing the existing into something rational. The project for Rundzug Süd here, he replaces everything, right? But all is inspired by all the photographs of the existing, which you see here. So you replace the existing with the existing in a way. And at the scale, more the scale of architecture, where am I? Projects that are like Noah's Arks, you know, embarking all the components, rational components and elements of architecture, of the history of architecture, into new kinds of organization. The house, like the city, as a Noah's Ark, you know, of all these components and ingredients there.